Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Populist, and this is number 19 of the Dev Diaries for Crusader Kings III, and today we're going to talk about factions and civil wars, a very intricate and a very important topic because CK2 suffers when it comes to, the opportunities that you get for both civil wars, of course, and factions themselves. Now, when it comes to civil wars, I also need to include the CK2 rebellions here, be it a peasant rebellion or be it a religious rebellion, because all of those rebellions, while of course not being spawned in by actual characters, the characters are only generated once the rebellion actually spawns, are very intricate and rather developed in CK3. I'm very excited to see what they've done with them, and you will see why in a second here. I think this is another dev diary, and I know that we've had a lot of these in, this sort of manner. I think this is another dev diary where we can see that they actually learned from the issues of CK2, and that they learned from it to a great degree. Now let's jump straight into this. How do we deal with factions? How do factions deal with us? And what exactly is a civil war? And how does it work in CK3? Factions that grow large enough will eventually deliver an ultimatum to their liege, demanding certain concessions in exchange for continued peace. You can see that right here. This is a faction screen similar to how we know it from CK2. We have this faction screen right here. Now, there are no factions because this is just the game start, but they would pop up here with their demand, then with a founder, and of course with everybody else. In CK3, you have a very similar claim. This one is a claimant faction that wants to install this man over here, Duke Robert of Burgundy. They have a military power scale and they have a discontent scale, very similar to how it works in CK2 as well. Now, here in CK3, it will work a little bit differently. In CK3, it works in a way where the discontent will rise, based just on normal stuff, on events, on war, on exhaustion, on opinion, that sort of stuff. And it will especially rise if the military power of the faction is, over a certain threshold, in this case 80%, then it will rise up. And the longer the discontent rises, the quicker, or rather the more likely they are to rebel. So that is essentially how the screen works. It's very, it's good, it's easy to read, I think. You can also see this is a count because of the bronze background. This is a silver background, so it's a duke, and this one as well, of course. So with that being said, factions on the base level and, superficially speaking, still fairly similar to CK2, except they now have something ticking up that makes it more likely that they, will actually fire their event, which in CK2 isn't the case. In CK2, as long as they have a certain military power compared to you, they just have a random modifier, or at least that is what is visible to the player. So now we have a little bit more overview of when we can expect a faction to rebel, and we know that the more powerful that faction is, the more likely they are to rebel because the discontent rises quicker. Of course, it makes sense. You want to seize the moment whenever you are strong enough to essentially go against the liege and, be a traitor. There you go. Factions also have a discontent score, which gauges how close the faction is to sending their ultimatum. You can see right here the military power goes over a certain threshold, as I said, and if it reaches 80%, then the discontent will accrue very much quicker. Stronger factions acquire discontent rapidly in an attempt to seize the moment, and that's exactly the point, which makes it very obvious to the player, hey, when do I have to take care of these factions? When do I have to take a look at my vassals and make sure that no one joins the factions? Now, this screenshot is excellent. It's a very nice screenshot. Let's take a look at this in detail. You can see the Italian northern peninsula, or whatever is in the Holy Roman Empire. You can see here Genoa, so the Republic. You can see the Republic of Venice, and then over here all the dukes that are loyal to the Holy Roman Empire. So that would be Friuli, or is it... What is this Dutch actually called? Yeah, it's Friuli or Verona. I assume Friuli based on the banner. Then down here we have rebels. Those rebels are an Italian faction that have decided that it is time to go against the Holy Roman Emperor. I don't actually know. I've never seen this sigil, but that aside, it's a very basic map. What I want to point out is, how much I like the fact that, now the Alps are actually so much more pronounced in comparison to CK2. It looks like a real mountain range and not just like, essentially this. It looks nice, honestly, but also so very strange, whereas CK3 I think is a bit more on point with it. So with that being said, we can clearly make out who is rebelling and who isn't rebelling. This faction fired. We got another screen of this in a second, but let's take a look at how rebellions actually work. Unlike in CK2, when a civil war is declared, faction members do not form a new temporary realm. While they normally remain vassals of their liege, they will immediately stop providing taxes and levies to them, and their liege will lose certain access to certain powers, and they will of course immediately begin fighting. You can see right here that this faction will be hostile or is hostile to the Holy Roman Emperor. You can see some of their troops right here, and then some of your troops right over here. And it's interesting because the whole temporary realm issue in CK2 is indeed a huge issue, because the way it works in CK2, if you hold a temporary title, you are barred from, for example, getting new alliances. You are barred from peacing out if anyone occupies a part of your realm. So, for example, if I, as the Holy Roman Emperor, have any rebellion going on against me, and I, defeat them at 100%, I will not be able to peace them out if, for example, Poland has sieged down even one holding in that faction's territory, making it very, very annoying. Instead, the way I assume this will be handled is essentially that if Poland were to declare on that faction, it would technically and nominally be a war on me because they are technically still a part of me. This takes away the issue of, temporary titles, them getting bugged out. It takes away the issue of so many different things, again, what I just said with the alliance and whatnot. And I think this is a very good step because it's a very basic step. It makes it so, it doesn't change much in the game, but the effect is quite interesting as the people no longer, have a temporary title to flaunt around with and have the issue of not being able to be pieced out, etc., etc. So many very basic issues get dealt with right with this temporary title. A victorious faction will enforce their ultimatum with some additional concessions thrown in, while a victorious liege will imprison all faction members and gain title revocation reasons against them. If a white peace is agreed to, things largely go back to where they were, the way they were, though the liege gains an imprisonment reason against all the rebels. So essentially, if you accept a faction demand, without a war, just the peaceful ultimatum, that will just be it. There will be no further strings attached. There's no more demands. It's just that ultimatum's demands. That if you challenge them to a war because you say, I will not give in to you, and they win, they get even more than what they originally demanded. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that is something that we oftentimes look forward to, In CK2, I hear it quite often, actually. I like the CK2 CB system, I have to admit it. But I can definitely acknowledge that it is, valid criticism to say, hey, if I get fully sieged down, if I have a civil war that goes on for 5 years, and everybody's dead, and everything is horrifying, and I just get like this meager goal that I wanted at the start, that's a bit weak, isn't it? We need some more stuff. And I think this, as a basic requirement, essentially adding more, issues that you get whenever you actually have to fight the war instead of just getting the ultimatum granted, I think that makes a lot of sense. It makes it a lot more attractive to risk a war as well, because if you were to win it, instead of just getting the ultimatum that you sent to your liege, acknowledged, then you will come out with more as well. I think that is fair. I think that makes a lot of sense. And now let's move on to the meat of this dev diary, to the independence factions, or rather to the factions, I should say. Obviously, there's the independence faction, you seek independence, then the claimant faction, where you want someone else on the throne, or for other titles, etc., etc. The liberty faction, where you just want crown authority, which is essentially the decreased council authority faction in CK2. Then the populist faction, seeking to form a new realm of their religion and culture, and the peasant faction, seeking to pay fewer taxes to their liege. Both of these are the most interesting part of this dev diary, but, to that we will get in a second. Not being a de jure vassal of their liege is, of course, or of your liege is, of course, fundamental to joining an independence faction, not sharing the liege's culture and the religious hostility towards their liege. Thank you, Web. I thank you for this. Alright, nothing, and not too interesting there. I was thinking about it. Is that private information? But definitely not. It is just spam. Now, that being said, here we have a very interesting screen. It is a war screen, but, for what we've seen up here, this is the Italian War for Independence. As you can see, they are bunched up down here. Those are the borders that we've seen up here as well. And the way this works is essentially, we've seen this screen before, I think in the last dev diary even. And here you can see what happens if you lose, if you were to lose, if you were to declare defeat. You would have to give all of these people independence. The leader, Duchess Matilda of Tuscany, who doesn't know her, would gain 150 prestige, and you would lose 150 prestige. And the list appears to be going on longer, but I can't actually tell. This war was started 3 days ago. Let's be real, that war isn't over yet. Now, that being said, I love this screen. We've had it in EU4 for such a long time. We've had it even in EU3, if I'm not mistaken, where you actually just have a screen that showcases you, hey, this is what happens if you sign this peace treaty. And this is just excellent. I love this screen, the way it is depicted here, and the way you can easily on the map, of course, tell what exactly is going on. I hope that once you open this window, the map mode just changes to this in the background so that you can see it at all times and don't have to like manually change the map visuals. But this is excellent. Very good overview, and I think honestly, this game just looks so nice when it comes to the map. Now, that aside, let's talk about the claimant faction, because we know an independence faction, of course, everybody gains independence. The claimant factions, on the other hand, are all about opinion. Vassals who personally dislike their liege while still feeling like they belong to their liege's realm will favor this type of faction. Of course, claimant factions are also an area where opportunistic vassals can push to acquire titles for themselves or their relatives. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. It's a very basic faction. We've seen it in CK2 all this time. The Liberty faction is a place for vassals who are almost happy with the current state of affairs. They want to lower either the realm's crown authority laws or their obligations to their liege, and are typically the easiest faction to manage. Those, of course, are the easiest to manage because, as we know from last week, there are now individual feudal contracts, meaning if you have a very strong vassal in the Liberty faction, you just gotta weaken their feudal contract, and they will say, alright, you renegotiated with me, thank you so much, and I will no longer join this faction anymore. So Liberty faction is definitely the weakest faction, but I think it is the faction where essentially the vassals gather if they have nothing else to do. And now let's get to the Populist and Peasant factions. My god. This is the step forward. It is a mix between the factions that, you know, not the factions, but the rebels that you can see in EU4 when it comes to their uptick. I think it also has something to do with from the looks, not really from the mechanics, but from the looks, it looks very, very similar to what we see in Imperator Rome when people, you know, threaten you with a civil war. Of course, the mechanics are quite different, but I think when it comes to the nature of, you know, their visuals and how they essentially, how you have to kind of understand them, I think they are fairly similar to that, because Populist and Peasant factions are something that we have in CK2 as well, although in a much, much worse way. So, for example, what I did here is Kaiser Heinrich IV of the Holy Roman Emperor, of the Holy Roman Empire. Of course, I said, hey, let's build a war chest, and that means we're going to take some money from the peasants. I did that. Now, the peasants are very unhappy. You can see the local revolt risk right here, plus 5%, and every month there is now a chance that this province will rebel. If it rebels and I destroy the rebellion, they get a negative modifier so that this goes a bit down, but I think it's only like a modifier of like 5%, maybe 10%. Either way, you will sometimes have provinces that just, you know, aren't at 0% revolt risk, and it is entirely random. Every month, there's just a chance where they could rebel, or they could never rebel, or they could rebel all the time. I remember when I did a playthrough as Genghis Khan, you know, where you have to conquer all of the land in Western Europe, or rather in all of Europe, I was just destroying, I was razing all of these castles and the cities and the temples and the children as well. And the way it worked was that I had just constant rebellions. I had a period of essentially a downtime, like 5 years, where I would just raze everything in a territory that I just conquered, and I was just squashing individual rebellions left and right. They had no chance whatsoever of winning, but they would just keep popping up. Now, in CK3, and I know this was a very long exposition, but in CK3 it is so much better. My god. Essentially, they now create factions for, be it, you know, these people here. This is the populist faction. It's culturally and religiously motivated. And then they have a faction for the peasant faction. And the way it works is that counties that have low opinions of you, and yes, you heard that right, counties have opinions of you. You can see it right here. Counties have an opinion of their holder, which is influenced by culture, religion, events, and war. So essentially all of these counties get together instead of rebelling individually. They form one conglomerate of enemies, of of peasants that want to rise up against you. And the other great part is that if they're not just unhappy, which is essentially this peasant rebel here, they can form populist or populist factions that, you know, are for one religion or culture. For example, you can see the unrest here in CK2 is for all of these people because they're all Slavs, and all these Slavs in CK3 would bound together into the populist faction. They would stand together and they would die together. And this is absolutely excellent because it now unifies rebellions, making it less of a tedious task to, you know, go around and beat up meaningless rebellions that have no chance against you. But it also means, and this is more important to me, it also means that their power is actually bundled, giving them some sort of hope to actually rebel and win. Now, the even better part, because yes, we aren't yet at the even better part. The even better part is the fact, and I can close these three, I think. The even better part about this is that any vassal could join the populist factions. Yes, that's right. If you have rebels that are Slavic, and you are a Slavic vassal, and you hate your liege, you can say, you know what, I'm joining that faction, and I'm having a good time with it. And then, if that faction were to win in a populist revolt, you would become part of that new populist realm. It is absolutely excellent the way that is solved, because it means that vassals now can actually form, you know, religion and culture-specific factions that will only trigger with the help of some communities, so with some counties. So a lot of changes here when it comes to how it works. It's no longer entirely random. They also follow the discontent thing. They will send you an ultimatum once they hit 100%. And this is just absolutely beautiful. I'm a huge fan of this. It makes quality of life changes that were absolutely necessary. It was very annoying to just go around and have all these rebellions pop up that were ultimately meaningless because they had no power. And it is absolutely excellent to see that even player vassals can get involved by joining one of these. Other than that, you would never be able to join a peasant faction, no matter what kind of rebellion it was in CK2, whether it was a religious rebellion, etc., etc. You would never be able to join it, but now you are. And you can even see right here the opinion of these counties. I can't identify these counties, I will admit. It looks kind of Dutch, I guess, but also Hungarian. You know, honestly, those flags probably mean absolutely nothing, but they are unhappy and they are willing to rebel. Now, let's talk about the populist and the peasant faction in particular. While populist factions are created by and primarily consist of counties, sympathetic vassals in your realm may also pledge loyalty to their cause. A successful populist faction will automatically usurp or create an appropriate title for their leaders to hold, which can even generate new kingdom tier titles in certain circumstances. You see Göteborg right here. I assume a Germanic rebellion, although it's a bit weird to see Germanics over here in the Slavic territory. Maybe the X is just a coincidence. I assume that this is literally the same Slavic territory that we have in CK2 as well, but I gotta tell you, the intricacy of these borders looks so much better than any border that I've seen in CK2. Oh, I need this map. I need this game in my life. Now, with that being said, peasant rebels, let's talk about those. Because, of course, you know, if you have... Oh, actually, let's finish off the popular revolt. I like reading this text because this is actually a very good text. All of this taken together means that any realm formed by popular revolt will end up being a formidable foe that likely has several de jure claims on its neighbors. This can substantially alter the balance of power in your region, even if you weren't the initial faction target. Of course, if they rebel, they may turn around and say, hey, Christian Poland, you shall also be beaten up because we're Slavs. Now, that being said, let's move on to the peasant rebels because I love this. There's no minimum military power requirement for the peasant rebel to revolt, and its discontent will always tick upwards at a constant rate if they are unhappy, of course. Now that reminds me of EU4's rebel factions very, very much, but it gets better. Every time the rebels' forces occupy a county, all of that county's levies will immediately join them. Oh, how long I have waited for a mechanic like that. Everybody will get up and say, you know what? Let's destroy them. Now the thing about it is, and I'm not sure about this, if you give into a peasant faction, they just pay reduced taxes and provide fewer levies to their liege. It's not that significant. So even if you don't have time to take care of them, I think, honestly, sometimes that may just be manageable. Although I think it should come at a great prestige cost. Giving into the rebel over there, of course, is a bit odd. Now, at the end of the day, I like these factions much more than CK2. They are much better done. What I will say before we come to faction management and then thereby are close to the end of this dev diary, if you've played HIP, if you've played CK2+, you will know other factions, and I think even Game of Thrones, right? You will know factions that aren't necessarily just against their liege. It's stuff like the court faction, the tradition faction, the prosperity faction, the loyalists, that sort of stuff. And I kind of was hoping that those factions, you know, a bit more just, hey, a general faction association life in CK3 would be in the game. But I will say I understand, you know, that was never the premise of the original CK2, that was the premise of different mods that did it differently. And I think that is perfectly fair. The way I see it here, what we have is essentially a further developed CK2 version of factions, and I'm very happy about that. In particular, again, about the Populist and the Peasant factions. I think those are incredibly cool. Everything else, it's just very nice that it becomes more reliable. You will roughly know when they will send the ultimatum instead of, you know, having a faction sit there at 190% and sometimes never revolt, sometimes revolt the next day. Now, that being said, how do you manage them? It's very clear. Any alliances you've made with your vassals will prevent them from joining. Any vassals you have a hook on will be unable to join, and if you intimidate vassals, that also works. High dread will lower their willingness to be in a faction, and vassals in the dungeons, of course, also can't join. Now, if you imprison people, that sometimes you can see that right here in this screenshot. If you imprison people, sometimes that may trigger the faction that they are a member of to revolt. As you can see right here, this person does not want to be imprisoned. Geoffrey of Calquier, if that is your real name. Since this is a tyrannic imprisonment, the faction will rebel, and this is a risk, I guess, that should be associated with this. This is a good idea. Anyone that is discontent, anyone that is conspiring together with this person, if you don't have a proper reason, will rebel against you. So that makes a lot of sense, but there's not much to be said about it. Vassals who are happy enough will never join any kind of faction, similar to CK2, which means improving their opinion of you and fixing structural issues in your realm will ensure that nobody challenges your rule. Now, that being said, this is the end of this dev diary. They have a very funny bug here where they essentially spawned in the entire population of Europe at the time of the game by accident as a rebel faction. Now, with that being said, the end of this dev diary, let me know what you think about the factions, whether you are content with the way it works or whether you want to join the Crown Loyalty faction. And with that being said, next week, and I know I've said with that being said a lot, but next week, finally, the religious dev diaries will start, and I wanna point out. Missed. There we go. Nope, that's not what I meant. Here we go. Not being a so I mentioned this earlier, but I'm not sure that I pointed out how important this is. Not being a de jure vassal of their liege, not sharing their liege's culture, or religious hostility towards their liege plays a role in independence factions. And religious hostility is a very different word from what anything we know in CK2. So I assume that, you know, the different religious tenets that you can set individually for every individual person will make it so that, you know, potentially there's going to be a huge change there in how vassals behave. I'm sure that we will learn about this more in the next episode, next week, when the CK3 dev diary about religion comes out. The first one of hopefully many. I am super excited for that. Finally, we're talking about religion. Now, that being said, last with that being said for today, I promise. I want to thank the members of the channel that are making videos like this one possible, namely the Barons Aaron, Stefan, the Richest T, Snywolf, Emma, Mello, Thomas, Lachlan, and Mitchell, and of course also the Counts, Shifty, Ixon, the Naughty, and Wombat, and last but not least, the absolutely beautiful Duke, Suspicious Duck, Benedict, Nathan, Knight of Squires, Kenneth, Lexo, Roboman, My Dad Left Me at Arby's, and Eric and Aiden. Thank you so much for being supporters of this channel. And I will see all of you next week when we talk, finally, about religions. Later, alligator.